Hello, viewers. It's time for Makgeolli Talk, my favorite time of the week. And today's topic is scaling recipes, making larger recipes. So that's today's topic. If you like this video, please click that like button and subscribe, and then click that bell so you're notified when I publish a new video, which is every week. I have a new video on the subject of rustic Asian rice wine. And I appreciate your help in spreading the word about rustic Asian rice wine by sharing this video wherever it is appropriate. So today's topic, scaling. My normal recipes fits in a 4-liter jar, and it's 1 kilogram of rice and 1 liter of water. What if you want to scale that recipe up? Well, that's not too hard to do. You just multiply the ingredient amounts, to fit in a larger jar. You can do that, and I published a video on that. And the thing I mentioned there, which got me started thinking about this some more, was all the ingredients, the rice, the nuruk, the water, scale evenly. If you want to make a recipe twice as big, you just multiply all the amounts by 2. One thing that doesn't necessarily need to scale the same is the yeast, because yeast reproduces itself. So just by, you can use the same amount of yeast, it's going to reproduce over and over again in the jar, and it's going to reach that final population pretty much regardless of how much you add at the beginning. It's going to fill the jar with as much yeast as possible given the environment. So as long as you have enough yeast to evenly mix in with the other ingredients, as long as you have enough yeast, it doesn't really matter how much. It doesn't need to scale up the same as the other ingredients. So, let's say you were making a recipe that was 10 times bigger. Maybe you'd want to add twice as much yeast as the small recipe, but you wouldn't need to add 10 times as much yeast. So that's a fact about scaling rice wine recipes, makgeolli recipes, is the yeast. And that got me thinking about other things that don't scale or that are affected by scale differently. So one of those things is the bubbling. Got me thinking, how much bubbling do you see in your brew? If you had a giant vat, it's actually true, you would see more bubbling, even if it's exactly the same amount of activity. Everything else is equal. In a large container, because it's deeper, you're going to see more bubbles on the surface in any given surface area, because what really matters is the column. How tall is the column of liquid that the bubbles are forming in? All the bubbles in that column are going to appear at the top. So what really matters in terms of how many bubbles you see per second on the surface, it depends on how tall the column of liquid is. So that's something that you might not expect. So it's going to look more active if you have a taller fermentation container. It's going to look more active than a small jar. Another aspect that's different, also because of the surface area of the top, is getting oxygen into the brew. The beginning part of the brewing process for makgeolli, you need some oxygen, and the stirring helps incorporate oxygen into the brew at the beginning. That helps the lactic acid bacteria do their thing, And so that's an important part of the brewing process, because there's proportionally less surface area in a large brew. You're going to have to be more diligent about that stirring to make sure the oxygen gets into the brew. In a smaller batch, you're going to get relatively more oxygen transfer just from the surface. In a larger batch, you're going to have to really be more careful with stirring to make sure that happens. Something else that doesn't scale with the size of your recipe is the temperature. You probably want the temperature to be relatively, the ideal temperature is relatively the same, whether it's a small batch or a large batch. But the thing is, with a large batch, the heat that's generated by the fermentation is going to be retained more within a jar. In a small jar, it's going to dissipate more quickly. It's going to be, just because the jar is small, the temperature is going to be relatively even throughout the whole jar. The top of the jar is not going to be much of a different temperature than the bottom of the jar. But in a large brewing container, if you had a huge vat, well, there are going to be temperature differences, and it's going to, the brewing process itself, the fermentation itself, is going to increase the temperature, and that could be a problem. So some stirring is going to be necessary to even out the temperature, and also being aware of the temperature and adjusting the environment appropriately to to keep the temperature within the ideal range. So that becomes something you have to worry about with a larger batch. And with a smaller batch, once it's usually more about keeping it. You might have to keep it covered to keep it warm enough. You won't have with a small batch, you probably won't have a problem with it overheating itself. But with a large batch, that is a possibility. Another difference with doing a large batch is that sanitizing becomes even more important. And that's because in a small batch you could afford to lose 1 kilogram of rice maybe, but if you're making a batch with 100 kilograms of rice, you wouldn't want that to go bad because of some bad sanitation procedure. So you're going to be motivated to do that sanitation properly. You don't want anything to trip up such a large batch. So there are, even though for the most part, scaling a recipe is easy. I've discussed it before. You just adjust the amounts proportionally, but there are aspects to scaling the recipe, especially to really large sizes, that you are going to have to make some changes in your procedure. So that's my advice to you. For now, I'm just sticking to my small batches, and that's for obvious reasons. These batches are for my own consumption. I'm not having a big party involving serving a large amount of makgeolli, so I don't have the chance. I don't have so I'm not trying to make a large batch right now. I'm sticking to my 1 kilogram batches, which produce about 2 liters of output in the end. So I'm sticking with that for now, but I have been thinking about what happens when you scale recipes larger. What are some of the non-intuitive effects of scaling recipes? And I'm sure there are things that I've missed. Let me know in the comments. And I hope you're enjoying brewing, whatever size brew that you want to brew. Thank you for watching.